Always love to get this guy on the show. Sam Monson, of course, the PFF NFL show pod. It's incredible work that they do on a daily basis, breaking down all things around the league. But of course, we're talking about our beloved Arizona Cardinals, who made 12 picks over the 3-day stretch of the NFL draft. And Sam, we were talking a little bit off air, but you think that most of the league has kind of figured out this draft thing a bit?
Yeah, like you don't have to go back very far where you would kind of do draft reviews and grades and all those kinds of things. Like, all right, here are the drafts that I really liked, and here are the drafts that were terrible. And there was a big mix of all of them. Like the last couple of years, it's like there's usually one team that does something a little bit weird, and that's the draft everybody hates. But every other draft, it's like it's just various shades of good, really good, amazing draft. I think the league is getting better at this. And even like last year and this year, actually, there were so many of these guys where even the players that you had kind of question marks about, or guys that were sort of unusual skill sets, they went to the right fit. They went to the right team for that skill set to work, So even the guys I think that have some flaws or some question marks seem to be landing with the right team. So I think generally the NFL is improving when it comes to understanding how to work the draft, not going off the reservation and doing something crazy that only you would justify. I think everybody is getting better at drafting.
That was one of the things we heard about Cardinals general manager Monty Ossenfort during his time in Tennessee. He had a good idea of how to marry a player's skill set with a coach's scheme fit. And that's how he was able to find some, guys on the free agent wire during the season. And they were able to kind of make do with a ton of injuries, especially when they made their way to a number one seed in the AFC playoffs. But when you look at what they've done in this draft, 12 picks, do you feel like Monty did a great job or a good job maximizing all those selections?
Yeah, I think they had a really good draft. Number one, 12 picks in and of itself, I think, is an important and positive thing. Like, I think generally speaking, the more you can draft, the better. And a lot of these teams, there's several of them now who clearly prioritize this as a draft strategy, independent of everything else. Forget the players, forget the positions we're targeting, forget exactly everything, every other element. We're going to make sure we pick 10 plus times every single year, because that's 3 extra picks that, other teams don't have. And it's 5, 6 extra picks that some teams don't have because they traded them away or they're working from less draft capital. So I love that as a strategy, generally making sure you pick as often as humanly possible and maximizing just the number of times you get to swing the bat. I think that's a really good thing in and of itself. But then, yeah, you look at the players that they've come away with. They choose not to trade down in the first round, not to trade out of that number 4 overall spot. And that means you come away with Marvin Harrison Jr., arguably the best player in the entire draft, independent of position. So I think that's a good move, right? If they'd been given a ridiculous trade haul to move down, maybe, sure, depending what the offer was. But I think it would have taken a big offer to make you move away from somebody like Marvin Harrison. Because of the quarterbacks and the way the draft goes this year, Arizona effectively had the number 1 pick in the draft, right? They got to pick the first non-quarterback in the entire draft, and it was a position of need, and it was a player that is one of the best receiver prospects to enter the league in the last 15 years, right? Whether you put him first or second in that list, he's right there. So great pick by them. I think Darius Robinson coming back later in the first round is a good pick as well. He's a sort of unusual player in that this year seemed to be a lot of classic tweener type body shapes, sort of guys that were not quite an interior player, not quite an edge rusher. I think 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Darius Robinson would be a top 10 draft pick. But the league has changed. It's gone to more, everything is kind of homogenized a bit. Most people are running more or less the same defensive scheme and alignment, just with some variations. And he doesn't quite fit into either of those roles. But I think in this defense, he'll be good. So I love those first 2 picks, the first 2 first rounders. And then I think there's several players, lower down the draft they got as well that I like. So good haul.
Yeah, they were certainly able to kind of improve a bunch of position groups. The defensive line with Robinson, Marv in the wide receiver group. They added a wide receiver late in the draft at a UAB and Tajon Palmer, but also were able to kind of add some depth pieces to their run game. Almost, they get one of the best run blocking tight ends in Tip Raymond, and you've got his teammate from Illinois who's probably going to kick inside, and Isaiah Adams, Christian Jones from Texas, and then added some 3 players to the defensive secondary. Is it as simple as like they added Marvin Harrison Jr. 4th overall or Darius Robinson 27th overall, that they improved their passing attack the most? Or where do you think this Cardinals team got better in which area?
I think you're right. They got better in several places, and they did it in a couple of different ways. They did it with a couple of different strategies. I think generally speaking, double dipping or triple dipping at certain positions is a smart way of approaching things. And you maximize the chances of getting solid contributions from whatever that position is if you take 2 or 3 players at it. But I think also there's some point where the certainty you have on a player being amazing kind of outweighs that, right? So this is part of why you want to draft 12, 13, 14 times a draft, because if you need a guy to come in at tight end and be an impact player right away, you can't rely on the first tight end you pick being that guy. You've got to take 2 or 3 and rely on one of them doing that, right? And it might not be the one you thought it was. It might be the second or the third guy. So for Arizona, cornerback or offensive line, you can't necessarily rely on it being the one player that you pick. But I think once you get to the stage where you're talking about Marvin Harrison, and it's like, this guy might be the best receiver to come into the league since Calvin Johnson, that we're really confident that he's going to be good. We don't need to do too much contingency planning on Marvin Harrison the way we might if we were picking, Brian Thomas Jr. at pick number 23 instead, right? That's a lot more risky. We have a lot less certainty about him or any of these other sort of second wave guys that we do about Marvin Harrison. So I think you can afford to say Harrison's amazing. We don't need to have the contingency there, but we also want, defensive back help. And that's where we want the contingency, because we don't have access to like a superstar. So let's get Max Melton. Let's get, Elijah Jones lower down. Let's sort of make sure we double and triple dip on that. So I think they've approached this really well, where the picks where they had line of sight on a guy that looks like a real superstar, they've kind of relied on that and said, okay, let's put all our eggs in that basket. But then other positions, they've said, look, we don't have, there's no obvious guarantee hit here. So let's maximize the chances that we're going to get something by getting 2 or 3 players at those positions.
It really felt like the first 2 picks off the board, the 2 first rounders, were slam dunks, universally beloved by the fan base. And then Monty kind of got to work, and we knew about, the 6 top 100 picks, and then he's able to flip 35 for another top 100 pick. He goes down from 35 to 43 and then picks up 79. It becomes kind of a debate. Was it the right move for him to move down from 35, add another 3rd round pick, but then pass on the ability to pick guys like Johnny Newton up front? Or if we're looking at the secondary and we're pitting Cooper DeJean and Kool-Aid McKinstry versus the player that they took, Max Melton, how did you think about that maneuvering?
So I think generally the data and the analytics would tell you that's the smart thing to do. They're typically that's when the drop off starts to happen, and the gap between the player you're going to get at 35 and the player you're going to get in the 40s or the 50s is a lot smaller than it is, in the first round, when you're talking about the difference between the top 10 guys and guys in the 20s and 30s. So I think generally in abstract terms, it's the right call. This draft, though, you're right, was interesting because guys like Johnny Newton had slipped. And actually, if they hadn't already gotten Darius Robinson, in fact, I like we were saying, Johnny Newton's a guy the Cardinals should get at that pick. And then they ended up going with Darius Robinson. So if they hadn't already drafted a guy at that spot, I think maybe Johnny Newton might have convinced them to change their mind, and he would have been a guy that you would go with. Cooper DeJean, interesting player, because the slide that he had on draft day kind of suggests that teams don't see him as an outside corner. Not because he's not good at anything else, but because it's a projection now. So if you think he could play outside corner and you think that we're comfortable there, I think he's a 1st round player. But if you don't, if you have concern about the change of direction, you're not sure, and he has to move to safety or nickel or whatever it is you're going to be doing, now we're talking about projecting him. And that's much more of a gamble. So I think that's why he started to slide, and is also a reason, I think, why you would be okay with moving away from that pick and going in a different direction. So I think generally it's definitely the right call. This time specifically, you could argue against it, but I think you would be attacking players that are either risky for some reason
Mhm.
or that you'd already attacked in terms of position.
Getting some great insight on the Arizona Cardinals draft here by Sam Monson from Pro Football Focus, the Pro Football Focus NFL pod. Follow him on Twitter at PFF_Sam. And I want you to get at your overall big picture what this draft does for the Cardinals potentially in the NFC West. But one last question as far as the class goes. Tip Raymond, the tight end out of Illinois, he goes 82nd overall, right? And like we saw Monty Ossenfort take premium position starters from rounds 1 through 3. So it was kind of surprising for us to see him go and get, I guess, at his ceiling is probably tight end 2, right? But more than likely, his role is run blocking tight end. What do you see? What value did you see in the Ryman selection? And do you like the player coming out of Champaign?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, I think teams can, if you want to use 2 tight end sets, you can get those guys on the field quite a lot. It's not just because you have Trey McBride and he looked amazing last season. It doesn't mean that there's just no role for this guy in the NFL and he's strictly a backup. It's not like offensive line, right? Where theoretically, if that guy's a backup, he's not playing all season long. You can get a solid contribution out of a second tight end, even if he's being going to be used as a passing game, as part of the passing game, not just as a blocker. And then the other thing is, teams tend to value those guys a little bit higher than I think everyone else thinks they should or would. And every year, you get a couple of those surprising mid-round draft picks where sort of what appear to be second tight ends, even second in their own offense in college, end up getting drafted in the second or in the third and fourth rounds, and you're like, huh. That's a little bit shocking. But it does seem to be a consistent area where the NFL values those guys at a higher level than the outside world does. But he's somebody that caught the eye at the Shrine Bowl, looked really good there. I think he's got the athletic talent, obviously, to be an impact player. So maybe it was overdrafting him a touch, but I think it's within the margins when you factor in what we just mentioned, that the NFL does seem to value those guys more than, the draft community, if you like.
Really tremendous insight. Generous with your time. Last question as far as what this draft, this offseason as a whole, because they made some additions in free agency. They added to the defensive line, one of the worst position groups in all the league last year, kind of raised the talent floor there with Justin Jones, Bilal Nichols, and then Sean Murphy Bunting in the secondary. And then you got a full offseason of Kyler Murray when they're a top 10 offense with him in the lineup. With this 12-person draft class, like what do you think is coming for Cardinals fans in the 2024 season with all these additions?
I mean, I think the top end of this draft in particular moved them on significantly. You're right. They made some additions to the defensive line, but it was like an entire defensive line of guys that you're like, those would be fine if they were the relief pitchers, but where's the pitcher? And so Darius Robinson's the first guy that comes in. You're like, okay, there's the guy who's going to be a big part of this defensive line. And Marvin Harrison, same thing. Like that's an intriguing receiver group, but it looks totally different when Marvin Harrison is the number 1 guy. And now guys like Michael Wilson can focus on being a really good number 2 rather than a sort of misfit as a number 1 because he's the only guy that was left. So the offense, I think, could get quite good quite quickly, particularly with the depth that they added in the offensive on the offensive line. I think the defense is still going to be a work in progress. There's now a lot of young guys there. We're going to sort of see who emerges and who kind of rises and stands up and looks to be counted going forward. That the defense might take another year, but I think the offense could definitely make this team a difficult team to deal with next year.
Love it. Check him out on Twitter at PFF_Sam. Watch his work on YouTube. Subscribe to their channel over there, Pro Football Focus, the PFF NFL pod. Sam, always great to catch up with you, man. Thanks.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.